Ever wondered just how HUD, this massive government agency we're talking about today, how it came to be in the first place?
Interesting question.
Get this. It's actually a legacy of the New Deal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Rooted in that time when, the government took a very hands-on approach to social and economic problems.
It's true. Back in the 1930s, the focus was really on tackling those slums,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And then, of course, creating jobs during the Great Depression. That's what led to, the creation of HUD's earliest ancestor.
So from slum eradication to, well, everything it seems HUD does today, how'd we get here?
Right.
Our source, this policy document outlining a conservative approach to HUD reform, it actually calls it mission creep.
Yeah, and this document, it digs deep, right? It looks at how over time HUD's mandate just kind of expanded.
Okay.
With each new piece of legislation, it got bigger and bigger.
Give me an example.
Okay, so take the Housing Act of 1949, right?
Okay.
It wasn't just about clearing slums anymore. It established this national goal of decent housing for all Americans, it said. That's a huge shift in scope.
Okay, so from a very specific problem to this, like much broader goal. And I'm guessing that kind of set the stage for even more programs, even more responsibilities under HUD.
Absolutely. Disaster recovery, homelessness assistance, fair housing enforcement. It all falls under HUD's umbrella now.
And that's where this conservative argument for reform comes in.
Exactly.
Because they would argue that maybe HUD's gotten too big, too unfocused.
Exactly. This excerpt, it reads almost like an X-ray of HUD's, like inner workings, listing all these offices, programs, positions, really highlighting the sheer scale of this department, which, for some, screams bureaucracy.
It's like they took one of those organizational charts and like blew it up to room size.
Yeah.
But even for someone like me who, I nerd out on this stuff, and even for me it's overwhelming, what are some of the key offices they highlight?
So two that really stand out, particularly in terms of their power and influence within HUD, are the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. We'll call it FHEO for short. Okay. And then the Office of Inspector General, or OIG.
Now, I know you've got to break these down for me and probably for our listeners too.
Right, of course.
Starting with FHEO.
So FHEO, it's all about ensuring equal access to housing.
Right.
Regardless of race, religion, national origin, you name it. And they've got teeth, these guys. They enforce major laws like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
They investigate discrimination complaints. They can even take legal action if they have to.
Wow, that's some serious authority. And the OIG, they're like the Internal Affairs Division of HUD, right?
Precisely. They operate independently, conducting audits, investigations,
right.
Basically making sure everything's above board. No waste, fraud, or abuse.
Got it.
Think of them as the guardians of taxpayer dollars.
Essential in any government agency, but especially one as large and influential as HUD. But getting back to this idea of reform, how does this document propose to actually change things?
Okay, so they take a kind of a two-pronged approach.
Yep.
So first, they talk about immediate administrative actions, things a new administration could do right away.
Gotcha.
And then they outline these larger, more long-term policy goals.
Okay, let's start with the immediate stuff. What are they looking to shake up right out of the gate?
One of the biggest moves would be shifting power away from career bureaucrats and more towards political appointees.
Interesting.
So think of it as like aligning HUD's leadership more closely with the administration's specific vision. Right?
Yeah, okay.
They even talk about using the senior executive service to bring in people who are already on board with the reform agenda.
So it's about putting people in key positions who, share their ideology, but it goes beyond that, right? It's about changing how HUD operates at like a fundamental level.
You got it. The document calls for like a total review of all sub-regulatory guidance.
Yeah, and that is?
Basically, they're looking for any rules or interpretations made by previous administrations that they might want to undo, especially those seen as pushing a more progressive agenda.
So less about creating new rules and more about hitting the undo button on existing ones. Give me an example. What kind of policies are they targeting with this?
Well, they specifically call out the Biden administration's property appraisal and valuation equity policies, or PAVE policies.
Right.
They see those as prime examples of government overreach.
Okay, I vaguely remember those being in the news.
Yeah.
Remind me. What were the PAV policies supposed to do?
They were framed as a way to address racial bias in home appraisals. The idea was to require more training for appraisers, encourage more diversity in the profession, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But this document, though, it argues that these policies actually undermine the integrity of the appraisal process and could even backfire. create new biases, they say.
So it's a fundamental disagreement over the intent and the potential impact of these policies. Is this a recurring theme in the document? Seeing things done by previous administrations as problematic.
Absolutely. And it's not just limited to things like appraisal policies. They also take aim at climate change initiatives within HUD, which, aligns with a broader conservative skepticism about the role of government in, addressing climate change.
Right. And then, of course, there's the, how do I put it? The elephant in the room when it comes to HUD public housing. This document doesn't shy away from that debate, does it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, they kind of dive headfirst into the deep end of the pool on that one.
Because even if you support the idea of, like, a safety net, you
Yeah.
can still have very different views on how that safety net should be structured, right?
Exactly. And this document really leans into the idea that the current system, while, well-intentioned,
Sure.
might actually be holding people back,
Mm-hmm.
disincentivizing work and upward mobility.
It's a complicated issue, right? Because on one hand, you want to make sure people have a roof over their heads, but on the other hand, you don't want to create a system that traps people in a cycle of poverty.
That's the heart of the debate. And this document comes down firmly on the side of self-sufficiency. They argue that, current programs, they can create a disincentive to work, which they see as detrimental in the long run.
And their solution to that is?
Okay, so they propose strengthening work requirements for those receiving assistance.
Okay.
Maybe limiting the time households are eligible for benefits.
Yeah.
And even changing how those rent payments are structured,
Interesting.
all with the goal of encouraging people to become self-sufficient.
It's like they're saying, look, we want to help, but we also believe in personal responsibility. But I imagine critics would argue that, this could leave a lot of vulnerable people without the support they desperately need.
And that's a valid concern. Anytime you talk about, reforming social safety nets, you have to weigh the potential benefits against the potential for unintended consequences.
For sure.
And those consequences can be significant, particularly for those living on the margins.
Absolutely. This document doesn't just focus on the, nuts and bolts of HUD programs, though, right? It connects these reforms back to these core conservative principles. Individual liberty, limited government, local control.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the diversity of communities across the country, right? And then trusting that local governments are, they're better equipped to address their own unique housing challenges.
So less of a one-size-fits-all approach and more like tailoring solutions to specific contexts.
Yeah.
But how does that actually play out in their proposed reforms?
Well, one example that really jumps out is their take on the Fair Cloth Amendment. You familiar with that one?
Vaguely. It rings a bell, but I could definitely use a refresher.
Of course, of course. So basically, Fair Cloth is passed back in '98. It put this hard cap on the number of public housing units that HUD could fund.
Okay.
And it's been this major constraint on expanding traditional public housing ever since.
So even if an administration wanted to, go big on public housing, their hands would be tied by this amendment.
Exactly. And this document, it argues that instead of trying to work around Fair Cloth, we should be looking at more fundamental reforms to, the whole system.
Okay.
Potentially even phasing out the traditional public housing model altogether.
Whoa, hold up. Phasing it out entirely. That's a pretty radical idea. What would they even replace it with?
Their answer, and it's a popular one in conservative circles, is housing choice vouchers.
Okay.
The idea is to give low-income families more control over where they live by providing these vouchers they can use on the private market.
So instead of being assigned to a specific public housing unit, they could use these vouchers to rent an apartment, maybe even a house in a neighborhood of their choosing.
That's the idea.
Oh.
But the document really emphasizes the importance of local control here.
Okay.
So cities and towns, they should have the autonomy to decide how those vouchers are used within their boundaries.
So a city could say, we're on board with vouchers, but we want to set some ground rules.
Exactly. They could impose certain conditions.
Yeah.
Maybe limitations on which neighborhoods the vouchers can be used in. And that, of course, gets into all these thorny issues of, local zoning laws, community resistance to affordable housing, even potential discrimination by landlords.
It feels like this could unravel a whole other layer of complexities.
It absolutely does. Vouchers alone can't solve those deeply rooted issues. But the document sees them as this key step towards a more market-based approach to affordable housing.
Because the thinking is that private markets are inherently more efficient than these like big government programs.
That's the argument. They
Yeah.
believe that moving away from this direct government provision of housing will, create more competition,
Right.
empower tenants, and potentially lead to like a more efficient use of resources.
But isn't there also a risk that this approach could actually exacerbate existing inequalities in the housing market?
That's the big question, isn't it? Critics would argue that it could lead to greater instability for families,
Hmm.
price out the most vulnerable, and even deepen segregation. It's essential to weigh those potential downsides against the potential benefits. There are no easy answers here, no easy answers when it comes to housing policy.
No quick fixes, no magic bullets. It always seems so much more complicated the deeper you go. And this document goes even deeper, right?
Right.
They don't just want to tweak HUD. They're talking about some seriously major overhauls.
They are. And one of the most radical ideas they float is the possibility of completely dismantling HUD.
Wait, what? Dismantling HUD entirely? Like it's just like gone, kaput. Explain this one to me. How would that even work?
It's a bold proposition, no doubt about it.
Uh-huh.
So the document suggests redistributing HUD's current functions to other federal agencies.
Okay.
For example, maybe you transfer those loan guarantee programs over to the Small Business Administration.
Chow, chow, chow.
Or maybe you move Indian housing programs to the Department of the Interior, things like that.
So basically breaking up HUD's like portfolio and trying to find natural fits within those existing agencies.
Exactly. And those functions that don't have such a clear home, like rental assistance or mortgage insurance, those could be consolidated into like a smaller, more focused entity.
Okay.
They even suggest potentially bringing back the old Housing and Home Finance Agency.
So instead of this one massive department, we'd have a more like fragmented system with all these different agencies responsible for different aspects of housing policy.
Precisely. Their argument is that this would lead to less bureaucracy, a more targeted approach, and ultimately a more efficient use of taxpayer dollars.
But wouldn't that also risk creating like more chaos and confusion? I mean, imagine trying to navigate that as just like a regular person, let alone as someone who like works in housing policy.
It would definitely be a massive undertaking, there's no question about it. And those concerns about potential disruptions and, of course, unintended consequences, those would have to be weighed very, very carefully. Dismantling a cabinet-level department like HUD, I mean, that would be a monumental task.
It feels like we're talking about like a seismic shift, not just in how the government functions, but also in how we think about the government's role in addressing housing issues.
You've hit the nail on the head. This idea of dismantling HUD, whether you agree with it or not, it forces us to confront a really fundamental question. What is the role of the federal government in addressing our nation's housing challenges?
Right.
Is it to, provide direct assistance? Is it to regulate and enforce fairness? Or is it to, empower individuals and local communities to find their own solutions?
Big, big questions. And it feels like there's a lot at stake in how we answer them.
Absolutely. And this document, even though it's advocating for a specific ideological approach, it highlights the incredible complexity of, housing policy.
It seems like every layer we peel back just reveals another layer of complexity. But I have to admit, I'm also struck by how this document, in its own way, kind of underscores the importance of good governance.
How so?
Well, I mean, even if you disagree with their ideology, they're making a case for things like financial transparency, accountability, efficient use of resources, all things that, most people would agree are important.
That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the idea that while there might be, these deep divisions on the what of housing policy, there's often more common ground when it comes to the how.
Regardless of your political leaning, you can probably agree that a multi-billion-dollar government agency shouldn't have shoddy bookkeeping.
Right, exactly.
Speaking of which, the document does mention that HUD's financial situation was at one point pretty dire.
Oh yeah, it wasn't pretty. They talk about a period where HUD's financial infrastructure was in such bad shape that auditors couldn't even verify the accuracy of their reports. Imagine that, a government agency responsible for billions of dollars unable to produce, reliable financial statements.
That's unsettling, to say the least.
To their credit, the document does acknowledge that steps were taken during the Trump administration to clean up HUD's finances, improve accountability. They even highlight the fact that HUD achieved, a clean audit opinion for the first time in years, which is a significant accomplishment in the world of government accounting.
So even within this document that's, advocating for shrinking the size and scope of government, there's a recognition that sometimes you need effective, efficient government.
Absolutely. And that emphasis on financial transparency and accountability, I mean, that's something you see across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it's about being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars, regardless of how those dollars are being spent.
Makes sense. But, even with those efforts to, clean up HUD's finances, this document still argues that there's a lot of fat that could be trimmed, a lot of redundancy that could be eliminated.
Right. They see a lot of inefficiency, overlap with other agencies, programs that, they believe are ineffective or no longer necessary.
It's like they're saying, even if we're going to have a HUD, it needs to be like a leaner, meaner HUD.
Exactly. They're looking for ways to streamline operations, reduce waste, and ultimately, what they would argue, deliver better results for the American people.
It all comes back to that core question of, what role do we want the government to play in our lives, doesn't it?
It always does. And whether you agree with their proposed solutions or not, this document forces us to grapple with some really fundamental questions about housing, about government, and about the kind of society we want to live in.
Because ultimately, those are questions we all have a stake in. It strikes me that this whole discussion really boils down to different visions of what the American dream, what it actually means, especially when it comes to housing.
Yeah, you've hit on a key point there. This document, it connects HUD reform to this deeply ingrained idea of the American dream, but with a particular emphasis on homeownership.
Okay.
They see it as being kind of eroded by what they view as these misguided government policies.
So instead of focusing on things like public housing, they would argue that the government should be doing more to, help people achieve that dream of owning their own home.
Exactly. They advocate for policies that promote private home ownership. Things like, tax incentives for home renovation, or maybe even relaxing zoning laws to make it easier to build new homes, stuff like that.
Which makes sense, I guess, considering their emphasis on individual responsibility and, limited government. But it also raises all these questions about fairness and equity, right? I mean, not everyone's starting from the same place, and homeownership has historically been a major driver of wealth inequality in this country.
You're absolutely right. And that's where these seemingly separate policy areas like housing and economic inequality, they become almost impossible to really disentangle.
Yeah.
Like, for example, how might these proposed reforms impact the racial wealth gap, considering that homeownership has historically been much more attainable for white families? These are questions that the document itself doesn't fully address, to be honest.
It feels like, honestly, we've only just scratched the surface here of a much larger conversation.
We've only just begun, really. And that's the thing about, these deep dives like this. They often raise more questions than answers.
Which I have to say I kind of love. It's like opening one of those Russian nesting dolls, only to find another doll inside, and then another and another.
And that's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn, more to explore. This document, with its very particular ideological perspective, it's really just one lens through which to view the complexities of HUD and really housing policy as a whole.
So where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listener? That one final thought to leave them with as they continue to, navigate this very complex world.
I think the most important thing is to really engage with these issues. Even the ones that, that seem jaunting or maybe outside of our immediate day-to-day.
Right.
Don't just accept any one viewpoint at face value. Read critically. Ask questions. Consider the potential consequences, intended or unintended, of different policy choices.
Because these aren't just abstract policy debates, right? They have real-world implications for people's lives, for the communities we live in, for the future of, the whole country.
Exactly. And the more informed we are as citizens, the better equipped we'll be to engage in these conversations and really advocate for the kind of world we want to see.
A world where, hopefully, everyone has a safe, affordable place to call home.
Now, wouldn't that be something?
That's a wrap on this deep dive into HUD. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.